Let's go straight to the morning papers. Helping us look at the top stories this morning is Jonathan Gibson from Young Voices. Jonathan, good morning to you.
Good morning, James.
Thank you for joining us. Let's start with Ukraine and the latest. These warnings that Russia is seeking to split Ukraine in two. Tell us more.
Yes, so Brigadier General Budanov is reporting that the split could mirror the partition of North and South Korea. And he's saying that this idea to split Ukraine in two is reportedly coming from the failure to capture the capital, Kyiv, and overthrow Zelensky, meaning that Putin is essentially trying to cut his losses and maximize on the situation. So it's a really interesting situation that the Ukrainians and the Russians are facing right now.
And we've had a bit of a backlash at Joe Biden for his Putin must go comment. Well, he's now denied calling for a regime change in Russia, but he's coming under increased questioning from journalists. Just to have a listen to some of the journalists shouting some questions at Joe Biden. I think this was yesterday.
Mr. President, do you want Putin removed? Mr. President, were you calling for regime change?
No.
And the White House moving to slightly soften those Biden remarks, Jonathan.
Yes, absolutely. So Blinken has absolutely reiterated that there are no current plans to remove Putin from power, and that's for the Russian people to decide who their leader should essentially be. But in Ukraine, the Ukrainian media has sort of hailed the speech as historic, comparing it to Kennedy's Berlin speech, though there has been, again, other upsets from individuals and leaders around the world. Macron has warned against the escalation of words or actions, saying that we need sort of united fronts. And Republican Senator Jim Borsch has described this as a horrendous gaffe, wishing that that Biden had kept on script. And Biden has had sort of a history of almost going off script, and it's sometimes been his strength and his ability to connect to the wider audience. But here it can be seen as an interesting, slightly different situation where a lot of his emotion, and you can see his emotion, you can see what he really, really wants to do, and many will be able to sympathize with his statement and with his rhetoric. But it's something that world leaders from around the world, including Nadeem Zahawi, who has tried to slightly distance himself from Biden's remarks, saying that it's for the Russian people to decide whether there'll be a regime change, not for the West.
And another round of peace talks are due to get underway later between Ukraine and Russia. The teams are meeting in Turkey. Is there hope for diplomacy, or are still some people looking at this and just thinking, yes, another round of talks, but is something really going to be achieved?
Well, Liz Truss has stated that she is sceptical of the idea that there will be any sort of peace between the two sides. And she's saying we need to keep enforcing sanctions and keeping the pressure applied to Russia before releasing them to sort of enforce diplomatic relations. Budanov said that they will continue to sort of push back Russian forces engaging in total guerrilla warfare. And there's really, really strong rhetoric coming from Ukraine now, where they're saying things like, there'll be one relevant scenario left for Russians, how to survive. And with this sort of rhetoric and with these sorts of sanctions, there has been the mention of neutrality by Zelensky. However, it looks unlikely because it needs referendums, it needs support from other neighbouring countries and big powers such as the US, the UK, among others. And so whilst there is a small potential, possibly, it is looking unlikely for Ukraine and Russia.
And moving away from Ukraine, of course, the cost of living crisis is something we've been talking about over the last few weeks. No doubt we're going to be talking about it over the next few weeks and months, but pressure seems to not go away from Rishi Sunak. Critics want him to do more.
Well, it's been described as a bit of a witch's brew by Steve Baker, who's a leading Tory backbencher, with more than 1 million people being expected to be pushed into absolute poverty, meaning they'll be living on less than $1.90 a day. And it's a really, really difficult situation for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was incredibly popular a year ago, but is now finding himself under pressure from lots of different branches in the party. There's divides between those who sort of want to balance the books, more traditional Tory values of cutting taxes, with those that have seen the polls, with 70% of adults worried about the cost of living and prices up by 5.4%. A whole 29% of adults skipped meals in the last 6 months to save money, with more than half using less heating. So it's really, really difficult situation where there's really growing costs of living. whilst there's also growing national debt, with 83% of GDP last year compared to 96% of this year being spent on their national debt. So it's a really tricky situation Rishi Sunak is finding himself in, and he's sort of being tugged around by different parts of the parties with different pressures from different groups.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because you talk about Rishi Sunak's almost past popularity. Was this when he took over as Chancellor? I think I recall when he delivered his first budget speech, were there not like a lot of people saying, particularly on social media, almost seeing him as the next Prime Minister? Has that changed because of the current situation?
Absolutely. I think he's gone from being almost a hero of the pandemic, where he was giving out money and providing support and having schemes in order to ensure that people could continue gaining a salary and not being hit incredibly hard by the pandemic. And Boris Johnson has actually said himself that without Rishi Sunak during the pandemic, the economy would have essentially crumbled much, much more than it did. But he's suddenly gone from this to being seen more as a privileged billionaire by voters. You had the photo of him borrowing a voter's car and wearing some different shoes, and it wasn't really in touch, it didn't feel, in many ways, with reality and with the reality that people are facing. And people are seeing their debts and their cost of living rising, so much so that they care about it more than the NHS now. It's the number one cause for concern. And they're seeing him possibly as slightly removed and slightly different as sort of the Tory billionaire who doesn't really understand potentially the suffering and the way in which the pandemic has really, really hit them so hard over the last few months.
One more story in the paper I want to look at in the Times this morning. City Hall tried to gag Met chief over ousting.
Yes, this is a really interesting story. Sir Stephen Howe said essentially that due process was not properly followed, and there was incredibly acrimonious negotiations between Dame Cressida Dick and Mayor Sadiq Khan. She railed against proposals to stop her speaking, and Khan also tried to prevent her being paid any extra money, but she was officially offered that later in a letter from the Queen. And we've seen sort of the trust in the police at its lowest point currently, with cultural sort of bullying and sexual harassment. This came after sort of her shock resignation after she had been told that she was planning on staying on for several months longer. And so it's a really interesting development where there seems to need to be more research and more investigation as to whether due process was properly followed and whether she was fairly treated. And there have been calls from that, and we'll just have to, I think, wait and see what happens in that process.
And of course, Jonathan, you've woken up early to prepare for this. Have you been watching a little bit of the Oscars as well?
Yes, I have been watching a bit of the Oscars. Yes, it's been very interesting this year, certainly. It's certainly been an interesting night for Will Smith and Chris Rock, as Chris Rock crowned it the greatest night in the history of television. Not necessarily sure about that, but it's definitely been an interesting one. And Kenneth Branagh, who was nominated, he's been nominated obviously for 7 Oscars and finally received one. And whilst I actually didn't watch him in Belfast, I always thought he was fantastic in Hamlet when I studied it at school. So I was very, very pleased that he'd been nominated for an award. So it was a great night, I thought, of the Oscars last night.
Jonathan Gibson of Young Voices, thank you for your time on Early Breakfast this morning.